The desert sun burned white over the beachhead like a verdict. In the distance, tanks rolled slow and confident, squared shoulders of steel glinting in the noon. Men with grease-streaked faces watched them go, and among them were crews of the American anti-tank sections, their world balanced on a short, neat tube, the 37mm gun. Light, mobile, and produced in numbers, the 37 had been the United States' answer to what planners thought would be enemy tanks, fast scouts, reconnaissance vehicles, and older designs. In training fields, it had seemed reasonable, easy to haul, easy to emplace, quick to fire. On paper, it had promise. On the battlefield, it would learn the most brutal of lessons, that theory and war are rarely the same. North Africa, 1942. The first true proving ground. The American infantrymen who met the Wehrmacht there were often young and hopeful. They had doctrine and enthusiasm and a gun that, against the light Italian and older German armor, could work. But the Panzer divisions that counterattacked were not the tractors of pre-war imagination. They were hardened, upgraded, and fighting with doctrine honed in Poland and France. The 37mm shell, small, fast, accurate at short range, struggled when it met sloped armor or the deeper metallurgy of German tank design. 100 meters could be decisive, and at that distance the 37 lacked the punch. Shells glanced off like rain on oilcloth. Turrets shrugged them off. Men who had been taught to trust the little guns found their confidence sinking as fast as the smoke from their spent cartridges. The failures were not merely technical. They were psychological and tactical. A small anti-tank crew, dug in behind a hedgerow or a low stone wall, had always been the infantry's secret weapon. A few men, a portable piece of steel, and the hope that they could stop a tank until friendly armor arrived. But at Kasserine and in Sicily, there were scenes that would be whispered about in mess halls for months. Platoons watching Panthers and Panzers roll past, machine guns blazing, while their 37mm struggled impotently at the flank. Officers wrote terse reports. The gun required support, they said. The gun needed tank backing. Where the doctrine had promised autonomy, reality forced dependence. German officers noticed. They did not openly gloat in formal reports, but in bivouac jokes and in procurement notes there was a tone of contempt, a child's cannon, some said, as Panthers steamed by without even slowing. It became a quiet humiliation for American infantry, an awareness that their light anti-tank arm could not be the final word in a fight against modern armor. That humiliation translated into a larger strategic anxiety. If infantry could not hold against armor, then defensive doctrine had to change. Supply priorities had to be questioned. Factories needed different blueprints. But from failure comes pressure, and from pressure comes invention. The problem was clear to ordnance officers and field commanders. The 37mm was not, in aggregate, a war-winning weapon against the latest German armor. It could not reliably penetrate the sloped front of a Panzer IV or the armor of the newer Jaguars of the German Armor Corps. The solution was not to throw more men at the gun pits or to hide behind tank traps. It was to get a different tool, one with a larger bore, a heavier shell, and greater penetration at practical engagement ranges. The industrial response began like a whisper. Plans to import and adapt foreign designs, to combine Allied experience with American manufacturing muscle. Britain, which had been fighting German armor for longer and under different constraints, had developed the 6-pounder, a 57mm piece capable of dealing with more modern armor at longer ranges. The logic of war economies is straightforward. Look where the bullets land, see what fails, and send designs to the factories. The U.S. Ordnance Bureaus did both. They tested, they argued, and they moved production lines into a new cadence. Meanwhile, in the field, men who had relied on 37mm guns were retrained again, and told to expect something heavier to arrive. The transition itself was not smooth. Logistics have the weary genius of always being in crisis. The Army had to retrain tubes used to light tubes, revise tactics that had assumed the 37 as the stopgap, and create doctrine that allowed infantry to operate more independently once again. It also demanded humility from a corps that had to acknowledge the gap between doctrine and reality. Commanders who had long urged aggressive forward positions now had to accept that the anti-tank limitation had been a real tactical handicap. The change required nights in barracks bent over manuals, after-action reports read by floodlight, and the quiet, slow work of teaching men to aim not at outlines, but at vital points, tracks, side armor, turret rings. places where a well-placed shot could not merely scare a tank, but kill its fighting capacity. Even as factories retooled, the front kept teaching its lessons. In the hedgerows of Normandy and the broken lanes of Italian towns, the 37mm crews did what they could. They improvised ambushes, they used terrain, they lured armor into traps, they waited for Air Corps strafing runs, and sometimes they sacrificed. Their experience would not be wasted. It would form the school from which the 57mm would graduate. The memory of tanks passing unharmed beneath their sights would fuel the urgency to equip infantry with the means to stand alone. And so the scene ends in a borrowed kind of triumph. Not the smug satisfaction of instant correction, but the harder satisfaction of learning. For the men who had fired the 37mm and seen it fail, the coming of a heavier gun promised a return of agency. For the commanders and ordnance officers, the lesson was sharper. Weapons that look right on paper must be judged in the mud and blood of real combat. The 37mm's early failure was not merely a tactical footnote, but it was the impetus here, a transformation, industrial, doctrinal, and human, that would change how small units faced the beast of armor. The mocking laughter of the enemy had stung. It would soon be silenced, not by bravado, but by a better round, a longer barrel, and men who had learned the cost of being underarmed. By the winter of 1942, the lesson of the 37mm had hardened into policy. Ordnance officers, field commanders, and factory engineers all agreed. America needed a new anti-tank gun, and fast. Reports from the North African campaign were unambiguous. Crews who had fired dozens of 37mm rounds at German tanks watched them ricochet off as if they'd struck a bell. "We might as well have been shooting marbles," one sergeant wrote bitterly. The Germans were advancing behind their armor like kings, and infantrymen once confident in their little guns now felt naked. Something had to replace the 37mm, a weapon strong enough to bite through German steel, yet light enough to keep up with the men who carried the war on their backs. The answer came not from a new American prototype, but from a partner already blooded in armor duels, the British. Since 1940, the Royal Ordnance had fielded the QHEF 6-pounder, a 57mm gun designed to match and overmatch the Panzers that had nearly strangled England in 1940-41. It was no miracle weapon, none ever is, but it was reliable, sturdy, and most importantly, proven. The British had used it in North Africa with increasing confidence, noting its ability to penetrate side armor on Panzer IVs and even threaten Tigers under the right conditions. In early 1942, representatives of the U.S. Ordnance Department visited the Woolwich Arsenal in London, where the 6-pounder had been refined. What they saw impressed them. A weapon only slightly heavier than the 37mm, but with double the destructive potential. They took the plans home like contraband treasure. The Americans would not simply import it. They would adapt it, retool it, and build it in their own way. Thus was born the 57mm gun M1, the Americanized 6-pounder, the weapon that would change the shape of infantry defense in Europe. Conversion from blueprint to battlefield was no simple act of mimicry. American industry was an engine of mass production, but it required redesign to fit existing tooling and assembly lines. British designs used metric threads and fittings. American factories spoke in inches. Everything had to be recalculated, retooled, recertified. Some parts were simplified, others strengthened. The British carriage was modified to match American towing vehicles and wheels. Barrel manufacturing was streamlined for mass output. The original idea was to produce both 37mm and 57mm guns simultaneously. But by mid-1943, the choice was clear. The 37mm would fade quietly into obsolescence, and the 57 would become the infantry's new shield. The weapon that emerged was both elegant and pragmatic. At a glance, the M1 57mm anti-tank gun looked unassuming, just another field piece, small and practical. But its long barrel gave it a fierce personality, the kind of geometry that whispered velocity and purpose. It could fire a 6-pound, 2.6-kilogram projectile at nearly 2,900 feet per second, with penetration reaching 70 to 80 millimeters of armor at 500 yards, depending on ammunition type.
Against the sloped sides of a Panzer IV, or even a Panther's lower flank, that meant death in one or two well-placed shots. The ammunition family grew with the gun. Early tests used standard AP, armor-piercing shells, but by 1944, new APC-BC rounds arrived, better at defeating German face-hardened armor without shattering on impact. The British also shared their APDS concept, though it was rarely used in U.S. service. For soft targets, or infantry support, HE shells provided flexibility, turning the M1 into a miniature field gun when needed. The versatility impressed commanders. One weapon, two worlds, anti-armor and anti-personnel. Training shifted quickly. Crews who had once hand-handled the 37mm were now retrained to handle the heavier but still mobile 57. They learned how to aim low and strike flanks, how to set up in hedgerows, behind stone walls, or at road choke points, how to work in teams with bazooka operators and machine gunners to create layered defense. In the new manuals, the gun was treated not as a desperate last line, but as a decisive ambush tool. Its carriage could be concealed easily, its low profile allowing it to disappear into terrain. One sergeant described it fondly as the hunter that waits instead of chases. The Ordnance Corps also understood that no gun mattered without logistics. Factories in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Illinois began producing barrels and carriages by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Ammunition lines followed. By early 1944, the United States had produced over 15,000 M1 57mm guns. Some were shipped to Britain and the Free French forces, others went directly to units preparing for the invasion of France. At the same time, doctrine evolved. In the wake of Kasserine in Tunisia, American commanders realized that anti-tank units had to be embedded, not isolated. The old model, separate tank destroyer battalions rushing to wherever armor appeared, was too slow. The 57mm, lighter and more adaptable, could be attached directly to infantry regiments. It gave platoons the power to fight armor themselves, to hold ground without waiting for cavalry. For the first time since 1941, an American infantry company could say, "We can stop tanks on our own." That shift in the psychology of the battlefield was changing the way Germans fought. For years, German armor had dictated tempo, appearing suddenly, striking, retreating, laughing at the ping of small guns. The 57, with its longer reach and lethal precision, would soon end that arrogance. American soldiers, still cautious, began to speak differently about enemy tanks. They no longer prayed for P-47s or Shermans to intervene. They spoke instead of range, deflection, and placement. "Catch him in the flank and it's over," wrote one corporal from the 29th Infantry Division in his diary during training. "The new guns got bite. Finally, something they'll respect." British instructors visiting U.S. camps in southern England were impressed by how quickly the Americans had embraced the weapon. They taught field tricks, how to dig the trail into soft ground for faster recoil recovery, how to use smoke to mask reloads, and how to call out range corrections under fire. Those small, hard-learned lessons would matter in Normandy, where terrain was treacherous and armor appeared without warning. By the spring of 1944, as men prepared for Operation Overlord, the M1 57mm had moved from experiment to standard. It was issued to nearly every infantry regiment, mounted on jeeps, half-tracks, and even small-towed carriages. Some airborne units adapted lighter carriages for glider drops. Its presence in supply manifests was a quiet revolution, a promise that infantry, not just armor, would now hold the line against tanks. The design had been borrowed, yes, but in the borrowing, America had found something essential: humility turned into strength. The 57mm M1 was proof that innovation was not about invention alone, but adaptation, collaboration, and relentless iteration. The gun had crossed an ocean and a culture of pride to become a symbol of Allied learning. The kind of learning paid for in the lives of those who had once watched their 37mm shells bounce harmlessly into history. Now a heavier answer waited in the hedgerows of France, patient and deadly. The Germans didn't know it yet, but the age of walking unchallenged through infantry lines was over. The next time their panzers rolled forward, they would meet something small, silent, and suddenly catastrophic. The 57mm wasn't just a gun. It was a reckoning forged from failure.
It began in the bocage, that cruel maze of Normandy hedgerows where visibility was a rumor and death waited behind every bend. The first 57mm guns landed with the invasion waves in June 1944, lashed to jeeps and half-tracks, wrapped in canvas still smelling of machine oil. For the crews who had trained in the calm meadows of southern England, the hedgerows were a revelation, walls of earth and roots 6 feet high, so thick that even tanks had to ram through them nose first. It was no place for open fields of fire. It was a hunter's country, a place where a well-camouflaged gun could decide the fate of a company in seconds. Private William Red Halbrook of the 90th Infantry Division later wrote, "It wasn't a gun anymore, it was a trap. You didn't move it, you hit it. You didn't wait to duel, you waited the strike." The 57mm gun, small enough to conceal yet strong enough to punch through the flank of a Panther, fit perfectly into that new rhythm of war. The Americans began using them in two-man teams, a gunner and a loader, sometimes reinforced by a couple of riflemen with carbines and grenades. They would set up at the corners of sunken roads, aim toward the angles where German tanks would turn, and wait. The first test came near Saint-Lô, where a company of the 2nd Armored Division was pinned by German armor attempting to retake a crossroads. The defenders had a handful of 57mm guns emplaced under a line of apple trees. When the Panthers appeared, their turrets glinting in the afternoon sun, the American gunners held fire until the first tank crossed the line of sight. "Target front, 200 yards. Fire!" The first shot hit low, punching into the side skirt. The second shot followed almost instantly, a burst of flame and smoke where the turret joined the hull. The Panther stopped moving, its crew bailing out into gunfire. In 10 minutes, 2 tanks were destroyed, a third disabled, and the German advance turned back. Word spread through the ranks faster than official dispatches could keep up. "The 57 works," they said in the mess tents and trenches. "You just have to use it smart." Officers began redesigning their defensive grids around that belief. In previous years, infantry had dug in and waited for tank destroyers or air support to save them. Now, with the M1, they could build layered kill zones, overlapping arcs of fire covering roads, bridges, and hedgerows. A single platoon could hold what once required a battalion of mixed arms. The weapon's power was psychological as much as physical. German tank crews, once accustomed to shrugging off small arms fire, began to experience the shock of sudden destruction from unseen angles. Reports captured from Wehrmacht regiments in Normandy mentioned new American anti-tank guns of small caliber but high penetration. In one report dated July 1944, an officer noted bitterly, "We cannot underestimate the new 57mm gun. Its small size deceives our reconnaissance, yet its shell cuts clean through the side armor of our Mark IVs." At Mortagne, where the Germans launched one of their last great counterattacks in France, the 57mm proved itself again. Infantrymen of the 30th Division faced tanks rolling through morning fog. The gunners waited until the Panthers exposed their flanks while climbing a slope. The first shots shattered road wheels, immobilizing the lead tank. Follow-up rounds struck fuel cells, igniting them in violent orange blossoms. By the time air support arrived, the German spearhead had already lost momentum. The Americans held. But the 57mm's greatest triumph came in its ability to make infantry independent. A squad no longer needed to radio for tank support every time an engine rumbled beyond the tree line. They could act. They could resist. Lieutenant James Porter of the 1st Infantry Division described it perfectly in his after-action report from August 1944. "When the 37 was our main piece, we dug in and prayed. Now when we hear treads, we plan. The 57 gives you the feeling you can do something about it." The weapon was not without its limits. Against the heaviest German tanks, the Tiger and later Jagdpanther, it remained dangerous but not decisive. At 500 yards, a frontal shot still bounced. The gunners learned to adapt. They aimed for tracks, gun mantlets, and vents. They waited for moments when the enemy turned to withdraw, exposing the softer side plates. Theirs was not the fight of equals, but of cunning and speed. The crews became masters of deception. They learned to fire once, then immediately reposition, dragging the gun into a new angle before the German gunners could pinpoint them. Some units built false positions with dummy barrels made of painted pipes. Others used smoke rounds to hide their retreat after a kill. The best crews could break down their emplacement, move 50 yards, and re-aim within 5 minutes.
"He never fired from the same hole twice," Sergeant David Kim recalled. "Fire, move, and pray they didn't see the muzzle flash." During the breakout from Normandy in late August 1944, 57mm guns rode forward with the infantry columns towed by jeeps that bounced along the dusty roads of France. In one encounter near Ardennes, an M1 gun crew destroyed a half-track, 2 armored cars, and a Panzer IV in the span of 15 minutes. Their commanding officer wrote in disbelief, "We were supposed to hold until the Shermans came. Instead, the Shermans caught up to find a road already clear." By the time the Allies crossed the Seine, the reputation of the 57mm had spread far beyond the ranks of its gunners. German after-action summaries spoke of American infantry using anti-tank guns in unorthodox ways, hidden in hedgerows, firing at impossible angles. One captured Panther commander admitted under interrogation that his crew had begun to fear the sound of a single sharp report in the fields. You hear it once, and you know you've been marked. Through that summer and into the autumn of 1944, the 57mm became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of adaptation, a quiet steel rebuttal to the arrogance that had once defined German armor. Each engagement added to its myth, and for the men who served it, the satisfaction was not in glory, but in vindication. They remembered the useless 37mm shells bouncing off Panzer fronts, the laughter of the enemy, the helplessness. Now, the roles had reversed. When the first frosts touched the French countryside that October, a German lieutenant wrote in his diary, after inspecting the burned-out carcasses of his company's vehicles, "They no longer wait for their tanks. They have learned to fight us on their own. The small gun, the one we mocked, is now our enemy." That was the verdict of the field trials, written not in test reports or engineering charts, but in the twisted steel left behind.
By the autumn of 1944, the 57mm M1 was no longer an experiment. It was doctrine. What had begun as a stopgap born from desperation evolved into a philosophy of how infantry fought armor. The gun's success had rewritten field manuals, reshaped training, and, perhaps most importantly, changed the psychology of both sides. For the first time since 1941, the American infantrymen could look at a tank not as an executioner, but as a challenge, one that could be answered. The transformation began in the small unit level, inside the platoons that lived and died with their guns. The men who served the M1 learned through fire what no classroom could teach, that survival depended on cunning, placement, and teamwork. The 57 was not a brute force weapon. It was a hunter's tool. Its low silhouette and narrow profile meant it could vanish behind a hedgerow, a barn, or even a roadside ditch. The key was to make the tank expose its weak points, the flanks and rear where armor was thinnest. A new art emerged, the ambush defense. Instead of facing German armor head-on, 57mm crews worked with infantry scouts to predict likely approach routes, crossroads, sunken lanes, and bridges. They dug gun pits angled at 45 degrees to those routes, giving themselves a clear shot at a tank's side as it turned or slowed. A single 57mm positioned right could stop what no 37mm battery ever could. "We didn't wait for them anymore," said Corporal Edward Hanley of the 4th Infantry Division. "We invited them." Infantry coordination became crucial. Machine gunners and riflemen provided spotting fire, marking the enemy's approach so that anti-tank crews could ready their aim. Bazooka teams, once desperate backups, now worked in tandem, finishing off damaged vehicles or targeting half-tracks and support infantry while the 57s focused on armor. It was a symphony of fire, improvised yet precise. The gunner, loader, and commander operated in unison. Aim, load, fire, correct, move. The crew drilled until those motions became muscle memory even under shellfire. The tactics spread beyond Normandy's hedgerows. In Belgium and the Netherlands, where fields opened wide and German counterattacks came with frightening speed, the 57's versatility allowed units to react fast. Companies deployed their guns in depth defense, multiple lines spaced along likely tank approaches. The first line fired to disable, the second to destroy, and the third to cover withdrawal if needed. The M1's light carriage made this mobility possible.
Crews could hook it behind a jeep, drag it by hand over mud or rubble, or conceal it under camouflage nets within minutes. German armor often rolled into what it thought was an empty village, only to find itself cross-fired by guns it never saw. In field manuals, rewritten late that year, the philosophy became clear. The 57mm is to be considered an offensive weapon when employed in defense. It was a strange phrase, but it captured the new spirit: aggression through precision. Crews no longer waited passively for tanks to find them. They sought terrain that forced the tanks into disadvantage. They learned to fire at the instant of opportunity and displace before enemy gunners could respond. The doctrine of fire and move, once reserved for tanks and mechanized units, became part of the infantry's vocabulary. For German tankers, it was disorienting. They had grown used to dominating open ground, using their frontal armor like a shield, but the 57 changed the geometry of battle. The Americans no longer needed to pierce the front. They attacked the idea of invulnerability. Reports from Panzer brigades in France described hidden guns of small caliber capable of killing from the side and rear. The Panther's thick glacis counted for little when a 57mm shell struck its exposed flank at 600 yards. Even a Tiger, as terrifying as it was, became vulnerable when funneled into a narrow road under crossfire. The Germans began to adapt, of course. They fitted side skirts, or Schürzen, to protect against shaped charges, and they deployed more reconnaissance infantry to clear ambush points. But the tide of surprise could not be reversed. In battle after battle, the 57mm turned open countryside into a labyrinth of invisible threats. The arrogance that had defined the Panzerwaffe was replaced by caution. German armor formations that once charged with confidence now advanced behind screens of smoke and artillery, a sure sign that respect had replaced mockery. Inside American command tents, doctrine officers watched the change with satisfaction. The shift in battlefield dynamics went beyond a single gun. It was a triumph of adaptation. Infantry regiments were once again capable of holding their ground without waiting for tank support. The 57mm gave commanders a measure of independence that reshaped defensive planning. Entire divisions reorganized their anti-tank companies around it, with dedicated logistics for ammunition and faster towing vehicles. What began as a borrowed British concept had become an American staple of combined arms warfare. There was, however, no illusion that the weapon was perfect. Against heavy German armor, the 57 still had limits. At ranges beyond 800 yards, or when forced into frontal engagements, it struggled. Gunners had to think like predators: hit fast, hit precisely, and vanish. "We learned to treat every shot like it might be our last," said Lieutenant Hadold Fisher of the 35th Infantry Division. "You aim for the road wheel, the vent, the turret ring. You don't try to win a duel. You kill or disappear." The Army's tank destroyer units learned from the 57 as well. While larger self-propelled guns carried the heavy punch, their tactics increasingly mirrored the infantry's smaller, stealthier ambushes. The success of the 57 taught the entire force a crucial truth: victory didn't require superiority, only surprise, coordination, and control of space. By late 1944, the effects of this doctrine reached even the enemy's strategic mindset. In captured Wehrmacht correspondence, one German colonel wrote after inspecting a wrecked column, "It is not the size of their gun that matters, but the cleverness of its employment. These Americans are learning our art, and they are learning fast." The 57mm M1 had given birth to a new kind of battlefield thinking, one in which every patch of ground could be a fortress, every hedgerow a threat, every silence a prelude to the crash of armor and the hiss of a shell. Its crews, once the overlooked branches of infantry support, became the unsung tacticians of the front.
By the time the snows of December 1944 settled over Europe, the 57mm M1 was more than a weapon. It was a statement. Across France, Belgium, and into the Low Countries, its thin silhouette had become as familiar to infantrymen as the Garand or the Bar. The gun that had once arrived quietly in wooden crates marked US 57mm M1 was now whispered about in German briefings as a threat that could no longer be ignored.
It wasn't the biggest gun on the battlefield, nor the most powerful, but it was the one that changed how men thought about fighting armor and about fighting fear. The Battle of the Bulge tested that legacy. In the frozen forests around Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge, the Germans threw everything they had left into the lines: Tigers, Panthers, and Jagdpanzer IVs, the last armored beasts of a dying empire. Many American infantry units were caught without heavy tank support. Snow clogged the roads, fuel froze in the cans, and visibility vanished into fog. For days they were alone, but they were not helpless. Nestled between snowbanks and pine trees were the 57mm guns, black silhouettes wrapped in burlap, their crews huddled in foxholes with numb fingers on the breech handles. When the first Panthers appeared through the fog, their commanders expected panic. Instead, they met the sound that had come to define the new battlefield: the sharp, precise bark of the 57. A shot tore through the side armor of the lead tank, igniting its fuel and blocking the road. A second hit a half-track behind it, scattering infantry. The ambush was over in minutes. When captured German officers were interrogated later, they admitted their disbelief. "We thought your small guns were useless," one said. "But now, every time we advance through a forest, we imagine them waiting." That psychological reversal, from arrogance to caution, was the true triumph of the 57mm. It restored parity where imbalance had once seemed permanent. Infantry no longer prayed for armor or aircraft to save them. They fought on equal terms, with confidence born not from size, but from skill. That confidence multiplied across hundreds of small engagements, shaping the tempo of entire campaigns. Strategically, the 57mm had done something extraordinary. It had democratized anti-tank warfare. Before its arrival, stopping armor required specialized battalions or tank destroyer groups. Now every infantry regiment had its own hunters. Each gun crew became a microcosm of independence, men who could hold a road, a bridge, or a village without calling for cavalry. This flexibility allowed commanders to spread their forces wider, to advance faster, and to absorb counterattacks without breaking. A few well-placed 57s could delay an entire German column for hours. Reports from late 1944 and early 1945 read almost like parables. One near Hürtgen Forest described two 57mm guns halting 6 enemy tanks, using terrain and crossfire to knock out 3 before retreating. Another, from the Siegfried Line, told of a single gun firing 17 rounds in a frozen morning, disabling 2 assault guns and forcing a full retreat. Each success was small on paper, one road, one hill, but multiplied across the front, they became part of the rhythm that ground the Wehrmacht into exhaustion. The gun's influence outlasted its war. In the immediate post-war years, analysts pored over the M1's record. They noted not just its kills, but the change in doctrine it had triggered. The 57mm had proven that mobility and precision could offset brute force. That insight fed directly into Cold War design philosophy: the lightweight recoilless rifles, the portable rocket launchers, the bazooka's descendants. Every modern infantry anti-tank weapon owed a debt to the humble 57mm and the crews who learned to wield it like a scalpel. The Germans, too, remembered. In captured memos from 1945, ordnance officers lamented that the enemy's smaller field guns, skillfully handled, inflicted disproportionate losses. In one haunting line, a colonel wrote, "We laughed at their 37mm. We do not laugh at their 57mm." For the Americans who had manned the gun, respect came slowly. After the war, they were often overshadowed by the tanks and planes that took credit for victory. But among the veterans themselves there was quiet pride. They knew what their weapon had meant. They remembered the feeling of watching a Panther burn through the mist, not with joy, but with relief. They remembered how their small gun gave them control over their own fate. At reunions years later, men would run their fingers over photographs of their gun crews, 6 faces crouched around a weapon that seemed almost too small to matter, and shake their heads at the irony. They called it a little gun, but it made big men out of us. The 57mm story is not of glory, but of redemption. It was born from failure, the failure of the 37mm, and refined through necessity, humility, and adaptation. It turned the laughter of the enemy into silence, and the fear of the infantry into courage. It taught an army that strength lies not in the size of the weapon, but in the intelligence of those who use it. When the war finally ended and the guns fell quiet, the 57mm M1 was retired, replaced by heavier calibers and newer designs. Many were scrapped or shipped to allies. A few were left behind in European villages as memorials. But in the memory of those who fought, it lived on, a symbol of balance restored. One German officer, inspecting a battlefield near Aachen in April 1945, stood beside a burned-out Panther with a neat hole in its flank. He tapped the edge of the armor, almost reverently, and said to the American correspondent beside him, "This was not luck, this was learning." He was right. The 57mm was not luck. It was learning made lethal, the embodiment of everything war teaches the hard way, that failure breeds adaptation, that respect replaces arrogance, and that sometimes the smallest gun can deliver the loudest lesson.